the talk will be basically in two parts. One is dealing with the technical aspects of climate change and why it's a scam. And the second part will deal with the kind of motivation that's driving it. And I think you probably already guessed quite a lot of the motivation, not dissimilar from what Neil was saying about people who are getting paid to meet the narrative. I'm a chartered engineer with over 30 years experience in design and commissioning of large power systems. And I can tell you now that net zero is impossible. Now, if you would like to ask me why, well, you'll find out as we go. So we're talking about, first of all, the relationship between what's coming in from the sun in the way of radiant energy and what's coming out of the Earth in terms of cooling at night. And the IPCC has got a theory about this. Now, as we go through, we'll expose some of that. So there are two possible approaches to science. One is you try to model the cause and effect and spend years trying to validate it. Sorry, there's a mouse around here. I don't need to speak. Okay, and that's the IPCC approach. Then the alternative is to analyse trends over the millennia and see what man's influence on temperature might have been in practice. The IPCC focuses on the CO2 greenhouse effect, mainly solar and planetary cycles influence global temperature, but they don't seem to be too concerned about that. IPCC output needs to be compared with the real trends, and that's what we're going to do. So I think the conclusions are quite clearly important because the UK is going to spend 5 trillion to eliminate 0.03% of global emissions. Just hold that in your head if you can. And that's to hold global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees centigrade based on the IPCC predictions. Now, if the IPCC predictions are wrong, then we are spending big money for infinitesimal gain. That is not doing any favours to many people. It's just not moving on. Why is that? Here we are. So the content of the presentation is the accuracy of IPCC global temperature predictions. That's the first thing we look at. Secondly, lessons from past temperature CO2 trends. Then we have the influence of solar and planetary cycles, which the IPCC doesn't seem to be very interested in. And then I'm going to deal with the impact of net zero on us. Now, that impact of net zero on the people is far more serious, and it's in the front of their minds, it's in their faces now, increasingly, as they're asked to comply with LTNs, they're asked to install heat pumps and buy electric vehicles, which nobody wants. So it has a big impact on us, and that is far more in the faces of the people than the theories of climate change. Their eyes glaze over when you talk about the theory of climate change. Then at the end, the question is, probably cover some of the same ground as Neil, who is driving this? Right, now, if we look at IPCC's predictions, you can see the red line is the prediction from the IPCC. Starts around about 1975 up to 2025. In practice, these are the average of the satellite and ground temperature measurements in practice. You can see there's a big gap. The IPCC have been totally out. They anticipated a rise over that period of about 0.9 of 1 degree centigrade. In practice, it was 0.3. Now, if I take a different period, if I had an agenda, I might not take this period, but I don't have an agenda. So I look back to this period, which is let me just check. Yeah, it's 1930 all the way up to 2030. funnily enough, the trend is down. How did that happen? The IPCC doesn't concentrate on that period. And we look at some changes in the Great Depression. The annual fossil fuel, the annual fossil carbon production went down, but the temperature went up. Then, during this period, I think they call this, part of this period is what they call the pause, and the fossil fuel emissions went up every year, and the atmospheric CO2 didn't go up by anything like the same proportion. Then we come on to, this is from Dr. Willie Soon, who's I'll mention again later. He demonstrated that in this period, around about 1960, the solar activity was going down, but the hydro, down at the bottom, the world hydrocarbon use was going up. So carbon CO2 content was going up, but the temperature in the Arctic was actually going down. And the reason for that was that solar emissions intensity was going down. Right, so IPCC models seem to neglect solar and planetary cycles. They neglect that CO2 is a follower of global temperature. So how can CO2 be causing a rising global temperature if it follows global temperature? Doesn't make any sense, does it? They also neglect the fact that the GHP impact of CO2 falls logarithmically. It's not linear, but their models seem to assume it is linear. They also seem to miss, you can't believe this, but I've been looking carefully, I can see no evidence that they take account of convection. Now, you imagine the amount of heat being generated or being released at the surface level, ground surface level, and that is clearly carrying heat to the upper atmosphere where it can radiate into space. The other thing they miss, their models don't include atmospheric moisture and cloud cover. Do you know why I don't? Because they don't know how to. So, a recent climate history, 12,000 years ago, a 2-mile thick ice sheet covering half of the northern hemisphere melted within 50 to 100 years. There weren't many people around then. The worst UK drought on record was in 1540. It saw 500,000 die. CO2 levels were lower than now. Since the 1920s, the deaths due to extreme weather has reduced by 90%. More are now dying from cold. That was in spite of a 6 billion rise in population and a 120 ppm rise in CO2 levels. CO2 levels were 320 ppm in 1965 compared with 420 in 2020. That's an increase of 1.8 ppm average per year. Humans contributed about 3% of that, and the UK contributed about 1%. On that basis, it would take the UK over 3,000 years to add 1.8 ppm to current levels. But human emissions have a very small impact on atmospheric concentrations, as seen during lockdowns. Lockdowns were provided some very useful evidence. They fell with no material impact on atmospheric concentration, even though a lot of the world's industry had locked down. The concentration actually rose, even during the lockdown period, by 2.5 ppm in 2020. That's 4,500 times the UK's average annual output. And since CO2 concentration did not follow human emissions, on the face of it, you could say, well, if humans didn't exist, would it have made any difference? Not a lot. Natural emissions far outweigh those of humans. Now, I find this is very interesting. This actually shows the variation in the bottom curve, show the variation in CO2 content in the atmosphere over the year. And the reason I find this so interesting is that the actual concentration goes up by plus and minus, varies by plus and minus 3 ppm over the year. Guess why that is? Because the sun moves around, or the Earth actually moves around the sun, of course, as Galileo told us. But you can see the actual relative position of the sun and the Earth changes over the year. And there's a law called Henry's Law, which says that as the temperature of the oceans increase, it releases more CO2. Now, you can't, nobody can, by any stretch of the imagination, say that that was due to humans. It was due to changing temperature, due to the sun. Oh, yeah, there's one other thing I was going to point out. If you look at the top right-hand side, that red bar is the drop in human emissions during the COVID lockdowns. And if you look at the curve, the top curve there, those are 4 years, 17 to 20. That drop, that red drop, had no impact. It didn't move the dial. Now the MSM links every new temperature peak and inclement weather to CO2 emissions, neglecting solar activity. But we know that the variations in planetary movements also influence global temperature. Some of those variations occur over many hundreds of years, and solar activity isn't constant, but they seem to assume that it's constant. Remember the cold winter of 2009-10 and the summer of 2001, which was the fifth warmest since 1895. Now, if you look at those peaks and troughs there, you'll see they coincide with those extreme temperatures. Now, I wouldn't say that, obviously, if the temperature was high due to the solar activity, if it was during the winter, it wouldn't be quite so noticeable. But obviously, when it happens in midsummer, it makes a difference. But the IPCC, ignore that. Now, NASA told us that a surge of infrared radiation from nitric oxide molecules in 2012 signaled the biggest upper atmosphere heating event in 7 years. So the reaction in the upper atmosphere was not related to the distance from the sun, it was related to the activity of the sun. And the radiation would have given an upward twist to temperature, giving us some record temperatures. The opposite occurred between 1645 and 1715, that's the Maunder minimum, when sunspot activity and global temperatures were exceptionally low, and the Thames froze over. Sunspot activity is now nearing a peak. It's expected to fall back, heralding a cooling impact on climate. But we see no evidence that upper atmosphere heating has been factored in to IPCC models. Never mind the other multiple influences, including the planetary cycles and almost infinite number of combinations. How can around 200 years of data be used for projections while neglecting the last 500 million years? So we come back there again to that error in the projections. It's only taken over a few years. The longer term trends, which are shown on the next slide, show the interglacial period going back 400,000 years. The previous peaks were higher, you'll notice, than the ones that we see now. As seen, the CO2 levels follow global temperature, so they can't be the cause of global temperature rises. Temperature rose by around 8 degrees C in 20,000 years, while CO2 levels have risen from 180 to 420. If we drop below 180 in the next cycle, then plant growth will die. So if we should do anything about CO2, we should make sure that it won't drop too low in the next cycle, if we can do anything about that. And there are the cycles going back 400,000 years. You can see that the peaks, interglacial peaks and troughs are shown on there. You can see that the peak now is actually lower than at least two of the previous peaks. And going back further, you'll find even more that exceed the current peak. So there is a professor, one of our universities, I can't remember her name because it's a Russian name, but she has actually done a lot of work on linking these cycles to global temperature. And it's quite clear that the sun, the interplanetary cycles and the sun's intensity are driving those cycles. And of course, you don't have to go back very far before you realise that man wasn't even around. That just shows you that in the past, the CO2 levels have been far higher in the Cambrian period. They were at their peak. It's over 20 times now what it is now. It's not surprising that ecosystems have got greener for more than 35 years with higher CO2 levels. And greening has increased in some areas due to higher CO2 levels. Some desert areas became productive when they weren't productive before. Did IPCC models miss that self-correcting feedback? Contributing to the flawed 0.9 degrees C? NASA concludes that increased CO2 levels are likely to have had a cooling effect. So what is the optimum? What is the optimum CO2? You won't get that from the IPCC or anywhere else. In 1850, CO2 was around 280 ppm, and plant growth dies if it falls much below 180. Well, around 28 on that previous curve, around 20k years ago, it was only 180. So as seen from the next slide, but one, Professor Haffer, this is another key factor, has shown that increasing CO2 concentration from 420 to 630 ppm would raise global temperature by less than 1 degree C. But the IPCC assume it's linear. It could be very risky to start the next downturn from a low starting point, when a rise to 535 from 420 would have a very small impact on global temperature because the relationship is not linear. So I believe that these are different. It's a greenhouse where the amount of CO2 has been varied. So on the left hand slide, the CO2 levels only 385 ppm. In the next slide, it's 535 ppm. Then it's 685 ppm. Then it's 835 ppm. Now it looks to me as if 535 ppm is probably quite a good level. And this is the curve I was talking about earlier. The fall off in the impact on global temperature is not linear. It's logarithmic. So if you go from where we are now, which is just about 420, add 50%, you get up to 680, and the difference between the two in terms of temperature is negligible. It's infinitesimal. And yet we're going to spend 6 billion, 5 billion to eliminate our emissions, which are a tiny portion. The UK's 1% of human emissions is negligible at 0.0005 ppm. China emits more in 11 days. I think if you take the rest of the world, apart from the UK, they emit over about 3. In 3 days, they emit the same as we do in a year. And at that rate, it would take well over 3,000 years, I think I said before. But as seen from the lockdown data, spending all those trillions to eliminate the UK's tiny contribution is futile. Now, I don't know if you can see that very well, but this shows you how much the emissions are in a year. So it's 100% of all emissions from the Earth. 3% of the emissions, that's the 3 blocks down in the right-hand side, is what humans emit. Now, this tiny dot down here, guess what that is? That's the UK's emissions. Who is really leading the way? We're supposed to be leading the world. Okay, this is who's leading the world. That's China's emissions. Our emissions are right down here, and they're falling. I call that the Chinese takeaway for various reasons. So the UK has cut its hydrogen emissions to around 50% of 1990 levels, more than most G7 countries. The cost to eliminate the other 50% is going to be eye-watering, and that's why no one else is following the UK. The premature closure of coal-fired power stations has left us exposed to excessive rises in gas prices. Our industrial electricity costs in 2010 were about average for the G7, but they're now over 50% higher and rising. So the other impacts are that around 130,000 people in the UK died in fuel poverty. It's more than 1.5 of all those who died that year. That doesn't sound quite right, actually, but I think it must be the other way around. Anyway, there's a fair percentage of people dying from fuel poverty out of those that die, and it's increasing. So the UK has deindustrialised faster than other developed countries, and energy costs 4 times as high as in the UK. I think it's more than double in Europe. Yeah, sorry, that was in the US. Yeah, so 4 times as high as in the US. And in the UK, I think it's 200 or 300 times, or not 200 or 300 times, 2 or 3 times what is in Europe. Only 12 days of gas storage we have, neglecting our own sources of energy, leaving us vulnerable. If we had a war tomorrow, it wouldn't make any difference whether we spent 3.5 or 10% on arms, because we would be brought to our knees within about 12 days or a few days more. Now, the LNG prices to rise by 60% by 2040, increasingly dependent on imported energy and products. Around 30 gigawatts of aged nuclear and gas power stations are due to retire by the early 30s. In the meantime, the load is going to be increased, as it said further down. It will exceed 80 gigawatts. It's about 45 to 50 gigawatts now. So you've got the generation retiring, and you've got the load doubling. And Mr. Miliband has not ordered any new power stations apart from wind, and maybe there's one gas, which has got CCS, that's carbon capture and storage, which has not even been proven. On some days, solar and wind power output totals less than 1 gigawatt. That's with about, 50 gigawatts installed. Clearly, trebling that will achieve very little. National Grid estimates that the cost for the grid will be 3 trillion. That's just to decarbonise the grid. And that equates to £100,000 per household. McKinsey estimates the total cost will be around 7% of GDP, which comes to around £170,000 per household. As I said earlier, the gas and nuclear turbine capacity shows no sign of being ramped up to carry grid maximum demand when solar and wind intensity is low. So power cuts are becoming a real prospect, and we had one close call in January you may have read about. On some days, wind and solar power output falls to zero, and so backup power generation will be needed, and that is not cheap. And in fact, I've done the calculations, and if you take the cost per terawatt hour as energy, that's a lot of kilowatt hours. It's actually cheaper for SMRs than it is for wind or solar with their need for backup energy, backup power. Right, and we're coming to EVs. Try not to spend too long on this because you probably know this. An ICE-driven vehicle can be fueled in less than 4 minutes, paying at the pump, for 600 miles. A 100 kilowatt service station charger will take over 10 times that to achieve a similar mileage. It's going to be years before you can get anything like the same sort of time. The Chinese now are saying they've got a battery that will charge within 5 minutes. But if you work out what size the charger's got to be, it's got to be rated at about 3 megawatts. If you had 15, 20 chargers on a petrol station, you would need a substation big enough to supply 10,000 homes. Well, yeah, I mean, you can imagine also. You imagine the size of the connections. I mean, I just don't imagine. I can't imagine how they think they're going to connect it.
And they need a fire station next door as well.
Yeah, they probably will. Yeah, exactly. So the transfer of petrol and diesel duties, which we all know about, the government has deferred taking action on that. Something like 20, 30 billion a year the government gets from fuel duty. Well, they won't be getting that anymore. So they're going to have to put up these charges on EVs. So you will see the average price will go up by about £500 a car. We see an emerging shortage of battery materials. This is worth noting. It will take over 100 years to get the lithium needed to replace 1,500 million ICE cars across the globe at the current rate of mining. EVs won't be cheap to run, and it will be a long time before they are okay for longer distance use. The IPCC acknowledges that our climate is driven principally by the sun. Higher global temperatures cause natural release of CO2, resulting in global greening. Natural CO2 release far outweighs human emissions, and IPCC models have been inaccurate. The COVID economic slowdown had no discernible impact, and CO2 concentration rose in 2020, despite the fall in human emissions. So spending all that money is not going to achieve very much, and it can't be justified. The UK's net zero policy will likely see more poverty and power cuts, driving more businesses overseas. There they will emit more CO2 as we lose our independence in energy and our competitiveness. We have neither the money, the materials, nor the skilled resources needed to achieve net zero. Phasing out fossil fuels without affordable alternatives was the height of stupidity. And net zero could raise our GDP ratio from around 100% to around the 300%, with little hope of it being paid off. We risk reversing many benefits delivered to mankind since the Industrial Revolution. For what? The progress of science has been hijacked by evangelists, ideologists, and globalists. So what should we do if we were in government today? What would we do? We'd exploit our gas, our coal resources, and avoid killing people through fuel poverty and power cuts. We defer the phase out of ICE vehicles and the gas boilers indefinitely and put an end to net zero, if not Mr. Miliband, along with LTNs, etc. We build more gas-fired power stations plus small modular reactors, and we just start fracking. We stop building wind and solar farms and install sufficient energy storage to stabilise the grid. Okay, so this is how do we get here? The target was set by Theresa May, putting it into law. She put it into law without doing a proper viability assessment or cost-benefit analysis. And now, very few MPs ask questions. They are abdicating to quangos, otherwise known as the blob, and they're allowing the blob to determine the agenda. So we're destroying jobs, exacerbating fuel poverty, raising the probability of power supply failure. And as you just said, we are increasing imports from big global emitters who are building hundreds of coal-fired power stations. Now, what are the possible motives? These are the possible motives, and I think you probably know them anyway. There are researchers, I think Neil alluded to this effect. There are researchers paid to sell the CC narrative, and all they do is keep on reinforcing or doing their best to reinforce the IPCC theory, which is only based on one model. Then you have the Chinese takeaway with their low energy and labour costs and a monopoly in material resources. So they've obviously got an agenda. Then we have the ones which are more difficult to identify. Those are the wealthy corporate stakeholders who are increasing their wealth by hundreds of millions. So billionaire wealth actually soared by 2 trillion in 2024, 3 times faster than the year before. But poverty has not been reducing. So we know where that money is going. It's going to people who already got billions. Big pharma funds, and I think Neil alluded to this, much of the WHO budget with they have prejudicial interest in WHO decisions. Then we've got military expenditure. To 2050 totals around 70 trillion. Then, this is a big one, projected global expenditure on net zero totals 270 trillion to 2050. That's based on McKinsey's estimates. So they're clearly big temptations. The ideology wants to replace the free market with central planning. That's what the Czech president said. The CCC narrative is set to embed Marxism as a dominant force for controlling liberty and choice, as Professor Philip Stott. The IPCC more closely resembles a political party convention than a scientific process. That's a US senator. The case for human-caused CC is based on lies, deceit, and manipulation. That's Dr. Mike Sandster. A few more quotes. We have to get rid of the medieval warm period. One respondent said in response to Mike Sangster's paper. The IPCC corruption has so severely tainted it that it's no longer a credible agency. That's Professor Don Easterbrook. Then we have man's hockey stick, which was based on misuse of data and statistical techniques according to Dr. Ross McKittrick. Then we have the impact of climate change will be small relative to other economic drivers. That's the IPCC in 2018. And yet our government continues on its disastrous course. The last one is CC hypothesis lacks empirical substantiation and needs fundamental re-evaluation. That's Professor David Legates. Now, I don't want to go on much more now, but there are clearly, we could clearly, if we could bypass the government and MPs, we might be able to achieve something. But they are all locked in to this law, this legislation that was set up by Theresa May, and it's far easier not to question. It's easier to just abdicate to the blob. And not challenge anybody. And so we must continue to challenge MPs, and you have to understand that this is their responsibility to scrutinise activities that are carried out or changes in policy, because if they're not scrutinising, they're no use. They might as well be redundant. Anyone who tries to withdraw might be tarred as a breaker of international law. That's another thing that we find that, they try to say that an agreement that we got, which is effectively a contract, is international law. Well, it isn't. NATO, WTO agreements we can withdraw from tomorrow. Right, I think these are some of the positive things, but I think I need to, probably need to close down now and ask if there are any more questions.